First I created a box, converted to editable poly, and using Swift Loop, added loops to get the dimensions of the workstation. To move the verts into position, I drag selected the loops I needed and then moved them. The bottom loop was chamfered as I needed more geometry. I then went into an orthographic side view to drag select the polygons I wanted to delete. Using the bridge tool, I began to connect the sides of the mesh that will eventually become the legs. I selected the top verts and scaled them down to get the shape. When I was happy with the outline, I applied a shell modifier with straighten corners applied to solidify it. Now that I've seen what it looks like with thickness, I removed the modifier and set the mesh up for symmetry and deleting unneeded loops to optimise the mesh. I selected the centre loops and used connect to create an edge along the middle. This let me delete half the mesh so I can use a symmetry modifier, saving me having to do the work on the other side. To create the legs, I applied an edit poly modifier to the mesh that will later be deleted, allowing me to work non-destructively. Using the bridge tool, I connected the edges. I then shift dragged the edges with snap enabled, matching the far leg. I then detached the leg as its own object and then deleted the edit poly modifier to revert the other mesh to its original state. So that the workstation leg doesn't intersect with the workstation, I applied a push modifier. To add thickness to the leg, I added a shell modifier. The loops on the leg serve no purpose and I could have deleted them earlier. To remove them, I added an edit poly modifier and removed the loops. Smoothing groups were applied to the leg to fix the shading. I'm now creating the desk that sits between the frame, but for this I need to thicken the frame. I applied a shell modifier to get the thickness. and applied an Edit Poly modifier, as I want to use part of the frame to create a polygon for the work surface. I snapped this into position and detached it from the frame. To differentiate this from the frame, I changed the object colour to yellow. I'm deleting the centre polygons so that when we use the symmetry modifier, the vertices won't overlap. Now I'm duplicating the surface geometry and Snap tool to align the back wall with the workstation. To create the bottom part of the workstation, I shift drag the surface, cloning it as its own object, and then snapped it into position. Before symmetrying, I attached the yellow parts together using the Attach tool. I wanted to see the full symmetry, so I selected the edge so that when I apply the symmetry modifier, it uses this to symmetry from. Here I was unhappy with the dimensions, so I simply altered the geometry by selecting the verts and using the Move and Snap tool to move them into place. I want to use the back wood to create a wood piece at the top. I altered the geometry so that it poked through the top without causing any useless polygons that won't be seen. At this point, I am deleting unneeded polygons to optimize the mesh. Now that we're done with the changes, we can remove the symmetry line and collapse to an editable poly. To create indents along the wall, I'm going to cut out a selection to work with. Now that I've dragged this selection out, I need to add circular indents to it. I used the Connect tool to create a grid-like pattern. Each square eventually turned to a circle by insetting them locally. Now I needed to add loops down the vertical and horizontal centre of the squares so that there are enough verts to form them into circles. To easily select the edge, I used the orthographic viewport and used ring select to select all the edges. The vertical ring was selected by using ring on the edge loops and then opening the modify selection panel and using select similar. To round the rectangles out, I needed to remove the centre vertices. I deleted the centre vertices, then capped them. You can find Cap by selecting Border Mode. It's under the Edit Borders panel. Now that the rectangles are flat, I selected them all using Select Similar, and under the Modelling ribbon, navigating to the Polygons panel. Under here, I selected Geopoly to turn the rectangle faces circular. Then the faces were extruded back to create the indents. Before snapping the new indented plane into the gap, the borders were dragged back to avoid light potentially leaking from the gap. Smoothing groups were applied to smooth out the mesh by using the Auto Smooth tool. You can find this under the Smoothing Groups panel, but I've used a hotkey. I created the drawers by extruding the face, as there was no need to create the inner workings of this part of the mesh. I began to resize the mesh to how I wanted. This gave me the chance to maneuver certain polygons into a better position. I found these errors along the back likely caused by the symmetry modifier. To fix this, I deleted the polygons with the intention of bridging them back with new geometry. The verts on the sides were overlapping, which didn't allow for bridging, so I collapsed them together. Before optimizing, I surveyed the mesh and found three main areas that we can improve. First, we have unnecessary loops along the draw area. The back part also suffers from the same problem. And lastly, there is a center loop along the top. I'm going to remove the loops and restructure the back part. I double-clicked the edges to select them in a loop, then hit Ctrl Backspace to remove the edges along with the verts. I then use the Cut tool to connect the verts so we don't have an n-gun. The back part was dealt with by deleting the polygons and bridging the edges back together. I removed the edges along the top using Ctrl and Backspace. I started the handle by dragging out a box on the desk. The box dragged along the other mesh because AutoGrid is selected. I then converted it to an editable poly for further editing. A Turbo Smooth modifier was applied to round it out and gain more geometry. It was now time to shape the result using the FFD modifier. When I was happy with the result, I collapsed to an editable poly. I applied a chamfer along the centre to further edit the shape. I then flattened the sides using the alignment tools and applied a planar modifier to squeeze them down. I needed more geometry to work with, so to smooth out the form, I used Swift Loop with Shift held to average out the curves. I had to manually edit parts of the end to straighten it up. The handle was further shaped using the FFD modifier. To create the sides of the handle, I aligned the edge straight and then dragged out new geometry from the side, then dragged out more for thickness, and then welded the adjacent verts together. The sides were chamfered to smooth them out. To complete the modelling, the handle connectors were formed and a symmetry modifier was applied. This was scaled upward, then better positioned. Finally, a single smoothing group was applied.